I'm sorry, but do you have any idea what this card is? The banker's voice was no longer polite, no longer routine, and the moment those words left his mouth, something in the room shifted, something quiet but heavy, like the air itself had changed direction, and yet just 1 hour earlier I had been sitting on a cold wooden bench in a public park with a single suitcase at my feet and $32 in my purse, wondering how a life of 40 years could disappear in less than a week, wondering how a man who once held my hand could look at me like I was nothing more than an inconvenience to be removed. My name is Margaret Lawson, I am 68 years old, and until that morning I believed I understood what stability meant. I believed that a home built over decades could not simply vanish because one person decided it was no longer useful, but I was wrong. I was standing in my own kitchen when Richard said it, calm, measured, almost bored, I want a divorce. And for a second I thought I misheard him because the sunlight was coming through the window just like it always did, and the coffee was still warm in my hand, and nothing in that moment felt like the beginning of an ending. My fingers tightened around the mug and I felt the heat press into my skin, but I did not move, I did not speak, I just stood there trying to understand how those words could exist in the same space as everything we had built. Richard didn't raise his voice, he didn't explain. He simply placed a folder on the table as if he were setting down a bill that needed to be paid, and when I opened it my chest tightened. Legal documents, signatures already prepared, assets listed in neat, unforgiving lines, all in his name, every account, every property, everything I thought was ours had quietly become his long before that morning. And then she walked in, leaner, younger, polished, wearing a soft smile that never reached her eyes. She looked around the kitchen like she was evaluating it, like she was already deciding what she would change, and Richard said the words that made my stomach drop, "This will be our house. Not yours anymore, not even ours, just his and hers." I felt something inside me go very still, not broken, not yet, just quiet. My ears rang softly and the room felt distant, like I was watching it happen to someone else. I wanted to ask questions, to demand answers, but instead I stayed silent, because something deeper than anger was settling into place, something that told me this moment was not the end, not really, even if it looked like it. Even if I walked out of that house with nothing but a suitcase and a past that no longer had a place to live, because as I stood there, listening to the man I once trusted explain my exit like it was a simple adjustment, I felt it, faint but undeniable, a small shift beneath the surface of everything, like a door I had forgotten was beginning to open. I did not cry when I walked out of that house, not when I closed the front door behind me, not when I carried my suitcase down the driveway that I had walked 1,000 times before, and not even when I reached the sidewalk and realized I no longer had a place to return to, because something inside me had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that does not come from peace but from understanding that everything has already changed. My hands trembled slightly as I adjusted the handle of my suitcase, the wheels catching on the uneven pavement, and I could feel the weight of it pulling against my arm, not just the weight of clothes and photographs but the weight of years, of routines, of a life that no longer belonged to me. I did not look back. Not because I was strong, but because I knew that if I turned around and saw him standing there, calm and unaffected, I might lose whatever control I still had left, so I kept walking, one step at a time, until the house disappeared behind the trees. And the silence around me grew louder than any argument ever could. The park was only 3 blocks away, a small place with faded benches and a few scattered trees, a place I had passed countless times without ever imagining I would sit there with nowhere else to go. I lowered myself onto the bench slowly, my knees stiff, my chest tight, and for a moment I just stared at the ground, watching a dry leaf move slightly in the wind as if it had more direction than I did. My purse rested on my lap, and when I opened it my fingers felt cold as I counted the money inside, $32. I counted it twice as if the number might change, as if I had missed something, but it did not. $32 after 40 years of marriage, $32 after building a home, after raising children. After believing that partnership meant protection, a quiet laugh escaped me, not because anything was funny, but because the number felt unreal, too small to hold the weight of what I had lost. I pressed my lips together and looked out across the park where a young couple walked past, their hands brushing lightly against each other, their faces relaxed, unaware of how quickly something like that could disappear. My chest tightened again, but I did not cry. I stayed still, breathing slowly, holding everything in place, because I had learned something important in that moment. Reacting would not change what had happened, it would only make me weaker in a situation that required something else entirely, something quieter, something more controlled. I stayed silent, just like I had stayed silent in the kitchen, just like I had stayed silent when Lena smiled as if she already owned everything I had built, because silence, I realized, was not the same as surrender. Sometimes it was preparation. My fingers brushed against the inside of my purse. Again, searching for nothing in particular, until they touched something solid, something unfamiliar in that moment but not forgotten, a small, smooth object, cool against my skin. I paused, my breath slowing, and without fully understanding why, I pulled it out, the old silver card, worn at the edges, simple, almost plain, with my name engraved in small letters, Margaret Harper, my maiden name, my father's name. I stared at it for a long time, my thumb tracing the surface as memory surfaced. Quietly, his voice, calm and steady, telling me to keep it safe, telling me it was not for everyday use, telling me it was for a moment that truly mattered. My hand steadied as I held it, the trembling easing just enough for me to take a deeper breath, and for the first time since I left the house, something shifted inside me. Again, not loud, not dramatic, just a small, deliberate thought forming clearly in my mind. I think this counts. I turned the card over slowly in my fingers, feeling the smooth edges press against my skin as if it carried a weight far greater than its size, and for a moment I simply sat there, staring at it, letting the memory of my father settle into the silence around me. He had never been a man of many words, but when he spoke, he chose them carefully, and I could still hear his voice as clearly as if he were sitting beside me on that bench. Margaret, money can protect you, but dignity protects your soul. Use this only when you truly need it. I had nodded back then, young and certain that I would never face a moment where something like this would matter, because life had felt stable, predictable, safe. But now as I sat there with a suitcase and $32, I understood what he meant in a way I never had before. My fingers tightened slightly around the card, and I took a slow breath, the air cool against my face, steadying me just enough to stand. My legs felt stiff at first, like they were unsure of the direction I was about to take, but I did not hesitate, not this time. I lifted the suitcase handle and began walking again, each step quieter than the last, not rushed, not panicked, just deliberate, the kind of pace that comes from a decision already made. The bank was downtown, about a mile away, a distance that once would have felt inconvenient but now felt necessary, almost grounding. The wheels of my suitcase rolled unevenly along the sidewalk, catching on cracks, pulling slightly to one side, and I adjusted my grip without thinking, my mind focused on one thing, the card in my hand. I did not know exactly what it would do, I did not know what it would reveal, but I knew this: my father had not given it to me lightly, and that meant something. People passed me on the street, some glancing briefly, others not noticing me at all, just another older woman walking alone in the middle of the day. And I let them see exactly that, because there was a certain kind of power in being overlooked, in being underestimated. I stayed silent, just like before, holding everything inside, letting the moment build without interruption. When I reached the bank, I paused outside the glass doors, watching the reflection of myself for a second, my hair slightly out of place, my coat wrinkled from sitting too long, my expression calm but tired. I looked like someone who had lost everything, and in many ways I had, but I also knew something they did not. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the air conditioning cool against my skin, the sound of quiet conversations and soft footsteps filling the space, polished floors, tall counters, people in suits moving with purpose. It was a world that once felt familiar but now felt distant. I walked toward the front desk, my suitcase rolling behind me, and waited until a young clerk looked up, his expression polite but distracted. "How can I help you today, ma'am?" he asked, his tone neutral, practiced. I reached into my purse and placed the silver card on the counter. Sliding it toward him without saying anything else, he glanced down at it briefly, then back at me, his eyebrows lifting just slightly, as if he was not sure what he was looking at. "Do you have an account number or identification?" he asked, still polite, but less certain now. I shook my head gently. "No," I said quietly, "just this." He hesitated for a moment, then picked up the card, turning it over in his hand. And I watched his expression shift, just a fraction, not shock, not yet, but something else, something that told me this was not as simple as it looked. "Please wait here," he said, his voice a little tighter now, and as he stood up and walked away from the desk, carrying the card with him, I felt it again, that quiet shift in the air, subtle but undeniable, like the beginning of something that had been waiting a long time to happen. I remained standing at the counter for a moment after the clerk walked away, then slowly lowered myself into one of the nearby chairs, the kind with firm cushions that never quite feel comfortable, my suitcase resting beside my leg, my hand still lightly touching the edge of the counter as if I needed something solid to anchor me there. The bank continued moving around me as if nothing unusual had happened, people stepping forward, papers being signed, quiet conversations blending into a low steady hum, and yet I could feel it, a subtle shift beneath the surface. Something had changed the moment that card left my hand. My fingers felt slightly cold now, empty without it, and I placed them together in my lap to keep them still. I watched the clerk disappear behind a glass door marked employees only, and for a brief second I caught a glimpse of him speaking to someone inside, his posture more rigid than before, his movements less casual. I stayed silent, just as I had been, letting the moment unfold without interference. Minutes passed, though they felt longer, stretched by anticipation. A woman across from me glanced at my suitcase, then at my face, her expression polite but curious, as if she was trying to place me into a category she understood. I gave her nothing, no explanation, no reaction. Just a calm, steady presence, because I had learned that people often reveal more when you give them silence instead of answers. My chest rose slowly as I took a deeper breath, grounding myself in the quiet rhythm of it, in and out, steady, controlled. Then the door opened again, and the clerk stepped out, but he was not alone this time. A man followed him, older, well-dressed, his suit sharp, his expression composed but focused, the kind of man who did not come out for routine matters. The clerk gestured toward me, speaking softly, and the man's eyes moved in my direction, studying me in a way that was not dismissive, not casual, but deliberate. I felt the weight of that look, but I did not look away. I met it calmly, my hand still resting in my lap, my posture straight but relaxed. The man approached with measured steps, stopping a few feet in front of me before speaking. "Mrs. Lawson," he said, his voice controlled, respectful. My name sounded different coming from him, not like a question, not like a guess, but like something confirmed. I nodded once. Yes. He glanced briefly at the suitcase beside me, then back at my face, as if he was taking in the full picture before continuing. "My name is James Whitmore. I am the branch manager here. I would like to speak with you privately, if that is all right." His tone was careful, almost cautious, and I noticed the way his hands were positioned, steady, but not entirely relaxed. I stood slowly, feeling the slight stiffness in my legs, and picked up the handle of my suitcase, following him without a word. The clerk stepped aside quickly, his earlier confidence replaced with something closer to uncertainty. We walked past the main floor, past the rows of desks and quiet conversations, toward a hallway that felt more secluded, more controlled, the kind of space where things were handled differently. The air seemed quieter there, heavier, and when we entered his office, he closed the door gently behind us, not with force, not with urgency, but with intention. He gestured toward a chair across from his desk. "Please, have a seat." I sat down carefully, placing my purse on my lap, my hands resting on top of it. Still, composed, he remained standing for a moment, holding the silver card between his fingers, looking at it as if it carried more than just a name. Then he took a slow breath and finally looked at me again, and in that moment, I saw it clearly, not confusion, not doubt, but recognition. Something had clicked for him, something that changed the way he saw me entirely, and when he spoke again, his voice was no longer neutral, no longer routine. It carried weight, respect, and something else beneath it, something close to disbelief. "I am sorry to ask this," he said carefully, "but do you have any idea what this card represents?" I held his gaze, steady, calm, and after a brief pause, I answered in the same quiet tone I had carried through everything. "No," I said, "not yet." James Whitmore did not sit down right away. Instead, he remained standing behind his desk, the silver card still held carefully between his fingers as if it required a certain level of respect. His eyes moved from the card back to me, studying, measuring, confirming something that I could not yet see. The room felt quieter than before, insulated from the rest of the bank, and I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning above us, steady and low. My hands rested calmly on my purse, but I could feel a slight tension in my fingers, not fear, not exactly, but awareness, the kind that comes when something important is about to be revealed. He finally lowered himself into his chair slowly, placing the card flat on the desk between us, aligning it carefully as if even its position mattered. Then he folded his hands in front of him and took a breath. "Mrs. Lawson," he said again, his voice measured, respectful in a way that had not been present when I first walked into the building. "This card is not connected to a standard checking or savings account. It is tied to a private legacy structure, one that is rarely seen and even more rarely accessed. I remained still, listening, not interrupting, because I had learned that silence often invites people to say more than they intended. His eyes flickered slightly as he continued. This type of account is typically established decades in advance, often by individuals who want to ensure long-term protection of assets across generations. He paused for a moment, watching my reaction, but I gave him none. My expression remained calm, steady, even though I could feel my heartbeat begin to shift, not faster, but heavier, more deliberate. He leaned back slightly in his chair, as if trying to find the right way to explain something that was not meant to be simple. Your card is linked to a master account that holds multiple layers of assets, including liquid funds, property holdings, and long-term investments, and based on what I can see here, it has not been accessed in over 30 years. 30 years. The number settled into the room quietly, and I felt something tighten in my chest, not panic, not confusion, but recognition. My father had given this to me all those years ago, and I had placed it away, untouched, believing I would never need it, and now it sat between us, carrying a weight I had never fully understood. Mr. Whitmore continued, his tone becoming more precise, as if he was now speaking from a place of certainty rather than explanation. The total value associated with this account is significant, Mrs. Lawson, very significant. He did not say a number, not yet, but he did not need to. The way he said it was enough. The way his voice lowered slightly, the way his posture remained controlled but no longer casual. I could see it in his eyes. He was not speaking to a woman who had walked in with a suitcase anymore. He was speaking to someone else entirely, someone he was still adjusting to. I inhaled slowly, keeping my breathing steady. My father's voice echoed faintly in my memory again, calm, grounded, never dramatic, and I realized something in that moment. He had not given me this card as a gift. He had given it as a safeguard, a final line of protection that he hoped I would never have to cross. Mr. Whitmore reached for a file on his desk, opening it carefully. Inside were documents, printed pages, numbers, names, structures that I could not yet fully process, but I did not lean forward. I did not rush to see them. I stayed where I was, composed, letting him control the pace of the reveal, because I understood now that this moment was not about reacting, it was about understanding. He looked up at me again. His expression now fully settled into something clear, something certain. Mrs. Lawson, he said quietly, before we proceed, I need to confirm something with you. I nodded slightly. Go ahead. He held my gaze for a second longer, then asked, did your father ever explain to you what he built, or who he was beyond what you already knew? I paused, just briefly, feeling the weight of that question settle into place, and then I answered honestly, no, I said, he never did. And for the first time since I walked into that bank, I saw something unexpected cross his face, not doubt, not concern, but something closer to realization. As if he understood that whatever came next was not just a transaction, it was a truth that had been waiting a very long time to surface. James Whitmore did not look away after my answer. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers pressing together as if he was organizing thoughts that had been waiting for a moment like this. The silence stretched for a few seconds, but it did not feel empty. It felt full, like something important was about to settle into place. Your father, he said slowly, was not just a mechanic. The words landed gently but firmly, and I felt a small shift in my chest, not shock, but something deeper, something that connected pieces I had never thought to question. I stayed silent, letting him continue. He built a network of investments over decades, quietly, carefully, often through private channels that do not appear in standard financial records. He paused, watching me again, as if expecting disbelief, but I gave him none, because something about the way he spoke did not feel exaggerated. It felt precise, controlled, like someone stating facts rather than telling a story. He continued, many of those investments were placed into long-term structures designed to grow without drawing attention, and more importantly, to be protected from external claims, including legal disputes. That phrase settled heavily, protected from external claims. My fingers tightened slightly against my purse, and I felt my breathing slow, becoming more deliberate. As the meaning began to take shape, he opened the file in front of him and turned it slightly so it faced him, scanning a page before speaking again. Based on these records, your father transferred full beneficiary control of this structure to you approximately 32 years ago, but placed access restrictions on it, ensuring that it would remain inactive unless you chose to activate it personally. I felt a faint pressure behind my eyes, not from emotion, but from the realization of how long this had been waiting, how carefully it had been set aside, not for convenience, but for necessity. Mr. Whitmore's voice softened slightly, as if he understood the weight of what he was saying. Mrs. Lawson, what you are sitting in front of is not simply an account, it is a protected financial foundation, one that operates independently from your marital assets, which means, he paused just briefly, allowing the implication to settle, it was never part of anything your husband could access, not legally, not structurally, not at any point. The room felt even quieter after that, and I could feel my heartbeat steady itself, not racing, not reacting, just aligning with a new understanding. I thought of the papers Richard had placed in front of me, the neat lines of ownership, the certainty in his voice when he said everything was his, and for the first time since that moment, I felt something different move through me, not anger, not sadness, but clarity, the kind that does not rush, that does not need to prove anything, it simply exists. Mr. Whitmore closed the file gently, resting his hand on top of it, and looked at me with a level of respect that had fully replaced any earlier uncertainty. There is one more thing you should know, he said carefully. The structure tied to this card includes immediate liquidity, meaning you have access to funds without delay, as well as authority over the assets connected to it, including properties and investment portfolios. I nodded once, slowly, letting the words settle into something real, something usable, something that shifted the balance of everything that had happened just hours earlier. My hands no longer felt cold, they felt steady, grounded. Like they belonged to someone who understood where she stood. I lifted my eyes to meet his again, and for the first time since I walked into that bank, I allowed a small pause before speaking, not because I did not know what to say, but because I wanted the moment to be exactly what it was, controlled, intentional, and when I finally spoke, my voice remained calm, even, unchanged from before. I understand, I said quietly, and then after a brief silence, I added, now I need to know exactly what I have, not out of urgency, not out of desperation, but because for the first time that day, I was no longer trying to recover from what I had lost, I was preparing to decide what came next. James Whitmore did not respond immediately after my question. Instead, he opened the file again and turned it fully toward himself, his eye scanning each page with careful precision, as if confirming details he already knew but needed to present in the right order. The silence in the room felt different now, no longer uncertain, no longer waiting, but steady, controlled, like everything was falling into place exactly as it should. I kept my posture still, my hands resting lightly on my purse. My breathing even, because I understood something important in that moment. This was not a situation to rush, it was one to absorb, to understand fully before making a single move. Mr. Whitmore reached for a pen and tapped it once gently against the paper, then began to speak. The total liquid assets currently available to you are just over $4.8 million, he said it calmly, without emphasis, without dramatic pause, as if it were simply a fact, but the number settled into the room with weight. I felt it in my chest, not as shock, but as a shift, a recalibration of everything that had happened earlier that day. My fingers pressed slightly together, steady, controlled. I did not react outwardly, I did not gasp or lean forward, I simply listened, because the number was only part of the story. There is more, he continued, turning the page. You also have ownership stakes in 3 commercial properties, 2 located in Illinois and 1 in Arizona, all currently generating rental income, along with a diversified investment portfolio that has been managed conservatively over the years. His voice remained even, but I could hear the respect in it now, the recognition that this was not a small discovery, this was something substantial, something long established. He looked up at me briefly, watching for a reaction, but I gave him the same calm expression, the same quiet attention, because I had learned that reacting too soon gives away control, and control was something I was beginning to understand in a very different way. He continued, based on current valuations, the total estimated value of all associated assets exceeds $11 million. The number settled differently than the first, not heavier, but broader, like it expanded the space around it. I felt my heartbeat steady further, not rising, not falling, just aligning with the reality of what was being said. $11 million, a number that existed quietly for decades while I lived a life that never once reflected it. A number that had never been touched, never been needed, until now. I thought of my father again, his hands worn from years of work, his quiet presence, the way he never explained more than necessary, and for the first time, I understood that he had not simply been saving money, he had been building something deliberate, something protected, something meant to stand outside of everything else. Mr. Whitmore closed the file gently and rested his hands on the desk, his posture now fully settled. "Mrs. Lawson," he said, "everything here is fully under your control. Effective immediately, there are no restrictions preventing you from accessing or restructuring these assets, and more importantly, none of it is connected to your previous marital estate, which means it remains entirely yours." His words were clear, direct, leaving no space for misunderstanding. I nodded once, slowly, letting that final piece settle into place. "Entirely yours," the phrase echoed quietly, not as a surprise, but as confirmation. I shifted slightly in my chair. Not out of discomfort, but because something inside me had adjusted, something had moved from uncertainty into clarity. I was no longer sitting in that office as someone who had just lost everything. I was sitting there as someone who had just discovered something that had always been there, waiting, protected, untouched. I lifted my gaze to meet his again, my voice steady, unchanged. "Thank you," I said quietly, and then after a brief pause, I added, "I would like to begin with something simple." He inclined his head slightly, attentive, ready, and I continued, "I need a place to stay tonight, not as a request filled with urgency, but as a statement of next steps, measured, controlled, because this was not about reacting to loss anymore, this was about moving forward with intention, one decision at a time." James Whitmore did not hesitate after I spoke. He simply nodded once, as if my request had already been anticipated. "Of course, Mrs. Lawson," he said calmly, his tone steady, respectful, not surprised, not questioning, just ready. He turned slightly in his chair and reached for his phone, dialing a number with practiced ease. I remained seated, my hand still resting on my purse, my posture unchanged. But I could feel the difference inside me, not in a dramatic way, not in a sudden rush, but in something quieter, more grounded, like a shift in balance that no longer needed to prove itself. I listened as he spoke briefly, arranging something in a tone that carried authority without effort. "Yes, this is James Whitmore. I need a suite prepared immediately." He paused, listening, then continued, "Under a priority client arrangement, tonight and open-ended." He ended the call without explanation, placing the phone back on the desk as if this was a routine action, though I knew it was not. "Arrangements have been made," he said, looking at me again. "A private suite at the Lakeshore Grand Hotel. It is about 10 minutes from here. Everything will be handled upon your arrival." I nodded once, acknowledging, but I did not thank him again, not because I was ungrateful, but because I understood something important. This was no longer a favor, it was a step, one of many that would follow. He opened a drawer and retrieved a small envelope, placing it gently on the desk in front of me. "This contains a temporary access card linked to your account, along with contact information for a private advisor who can assist you with immediate needs." I reached forward and took the envelope, feeling the weight of it in my hand, light, but significant. I placed it carefully into my purse without opening it, because I did not need to rush, not anymore. Mr. Whitmore observed me quietly, as if noting the absence of urgency, and I could see a subtle shift in his expression, not curiosity, but understanding. He recognized that I was not reacting the way most people would, and that told him something about me without a single word being spoken. "There is transportation waiting for you downstairs," he added, his voice steady. I stood slowly, picking up the handle of my suitcase, the same suitcase I had carried out of my house just hours earlier, but it felt different now, not lighter, not heavier, just different, as if it no longer represented everything I had lost, but simply what I had chosen to take with me. I paused for a brief moment before turning toward the door, my hand resting lightly on the handle, and then I looked back at him, not with hesitation, but with clarity. "Mr. Whitmore," I said calmly. He met my gaze immediately, attentive. "Yes, Mrs. Lawson." I held his gaze for a second longer, then spoke in the same quiet, controlled tone I had carried from the beginning. "I will need a full report of all assets, including properties, account structures, and any associated entities, delivered to me by tomorrow morning." There was no urgency in my voice, no demand, just a statement of what would happen next. He nodded once, without hesitation. "Of course, it will be prepared." I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging, then turned and walked toward the door, opening it and stepping back into the hallway, the quiet hum of the bank returning around me, but it felt distant now, less relevant. I walked through the main floor without stopping, past the desks, past the people, my suitcase rolling steadily behind me, and I noticed the difference in the way I was seen, subtle, but real, the same space, the same people, but something had shifted, not in them, but in me, I pushed the glass door open and stepped outside, the air warmer now, the light slightly softer as the afternoon moved forward. A black car waited at the curb, the driver stepping out as soon as he saw me. Opening the rear door without a word, I placed my suitcase inside and followed. Settling into the seat as the door closed quietly behind me, the car began to move smoothly, pulling away from the curb, and I leaned back slightly, my hands resting in my lap, my breathing even, my mind clear, because for the first time that day, I was not thinking about what had happened, I was thinking about what would happen next. And somewhere in that quiet space between thought and action, one realization settled firmly into place: I had stayed silent long enough. The car moved through the city in a steady, quiet rhythm, the kind that does not demand attention but carries you forward without interruption, and I sat in the back seat with my hands resting lightly in my lap, watching the buildings pass by through the window, their shapes familiar but distant, as if I were seeing them from a different place entirely. My reflection in the glass caught my eye for a moment, and I studied it without emotion. The same face, the same lines, the same calm expression, but something behind it had shifted, something that could not be seen but could be felt. The driver did not speak, and I appreciated that. The silence gave me space to think, not about what had happened, but about what needed to happen next. I replayed the morning in my mind, not with pain, not with anger, but with clarity. Each word Richard had said, each look Lena had given, each moment that had felt final now appeared different, smaller somehow, less absolute than it had seemed at the time, because I understood now that what they believed to be control had never truly existed. It had only looked that way from the outside. My fingers moved slightly against each other, steady, grounded. I thought about the house, the kitchen, the papers on the table, the certainty in Richard's voice when he said everything was his, and for the first time, I allowed myself to see it from a different angle, not as loss, but as exposure. He had shown me exactly who he was when he thought I had nothing left, and that knowledge was more valuable than anything I had walked away from. The car slowed as it approached an intersection, the light turning red, and I watched a woman cross the street carrying a bag of groceries, her steps careful, her focus forward, and something about that simple movement reminded me of the kind of life I had lived, steady, practical, built on routine and trust, and I realized that I had not been wrong to live that way. I had simply been incomplete in my understanding of what protection truly meant. My father had known, he had prepared for something I had not even considered possible, and now that preparation was no longer hidden, it was active, real, and entirely mine to use. The car began moving again, turning onto a quieter street lined with trees, the sunlight filtering through the leaves in soft patterns, and I felt my breathing settle into a deeper rhythm, slower, more deliberate. I reached into my purse and touched the envelope briefly, not opening it, just acknowledging its presence, a small reminder that everything had changed without needing to be displayed. I stayed silent, just as I had from the beginning, but the silence felt different now. It was no longer about enduring, it was about choosing when to speak, when to act, when to reveal. The car pulled to a stop in front of the hotel, a tall building with clean lines and polished glass that reflected the late afternoon light. The driver stepped out quickly, opening the door for me, and I stepped onto the sidewalk with the same calm movement I had carried all day, my suitcase following behind me as I walked toward the entrance. The doors opened smoothly, and I stepped inside, the air cool and quiet, the lobby spacious, filled with soft lighting and low conversation. A woman behind the front desk looked up immediately, her expression shifting the moment she saw me, not in surprise, but in recognition. "Mrs. Lawson," she said with a polite smile, "welcome. Everything is prepared for you." I nodded once, not slowing my pace, not questioning, just moving forward, because this was no longer unfamiliar territory, this was simply the next step. She handed me a key card, explaining briefly that the suite was ready, that anything I needed would be arranged, her voice smooth, professional, but I could hear the subtle respect beneath it. I took the card and turned toward the elevators, stepping inside as the doors closed quietly behind me, the numbers lighting up one by one as I moved upward, and in that enclosed space, with no one else around, I allowed myself one brief moment, not of emotion, not of reaction, but of acknowledgement. I had walked out of my house with nothing, and within hours, I had stepped into a position I had never imagined, not because something new had been given to me, but because something that had always been mine had finally been revealed. And as the elevator reached my floor and the doors opened, one thought settled clearly, firmly, without hesitation: they did not know who they were dealing with, not yet. The elevator doors opened with a soft sound, and I stepped out into a quiet hallway lined with thick carpet and warm lighting, the kind that absorbs sound and creates a sense of distance from everything outside. My suitcase rolled smoothly behind me now, no longer catching or dragging, and I walked toward the door with my room number printed neatly on the small card in my hand, my steps steady, unhurried. When I reached the door, I paused for just a second, not out of hesitation, but awareness. Then I slid the card into the lock and heard the soft click as it opened. The door moved inward easily, and I stepped inside. The suite was larger than I expected, wide windows letting in the last light of the afternoon, a sitting area arranged with quiet elegance, everything clean, intentional, controlled. I closed the door behind me and stood there for a moment, my hand still resting lightly on the handle of my suitcase, taking in the space. Not with surprise, but with recognition. This was what access looked like. This was what preparation made possible. I walked further into the room and placed my suitcase near the bed, then slowly removed my coat, folding it neatly over the back of a chair, each movement deliberate, each action grounded, because I was no longer reacting to anything, I was establishing something. I moved to the window and looked out over the city, the buildings stretching out in every direction. Lights beginning to turn on one by one, and I could feel the quiet shift inside me settle into something more defined, not just clarity, but direction. I reached into my purse and took out the envelope that Mr. Whitmore had given me earlier, placing it carefully on the table before opening it. Inside was a card, simple, clean, and a small piece of paper with a name and a number. I picked it up and read it once, then again, letting it settle. A private advisor, someone who understood the structure I had just stepped into. I placed the paper back down and picked up the phone on the table. Dialing the number without hesitation, the line rang once, then twice, before a voice answered, calm, professional. This is Daniel Reeves. How may I assist you? I did not rush. I did not explain everything at once. I simply said my name, Margaret Lawson. There was a brief pause on the other end, just enough to register recognition. Mrs. Lawson, he said, his tone shifting slightly. How can I help you this evening? I walked slowly toward the chair and sat down, my posture straight, my voice steady. I will need a full legal and financial review of my current situation, including any exposure related to my recent divorce, I said, and I will need it prepared by tomorrow. There was no urgency in my tone, no pressure, just clarity. Understood, he replied. I will begin immediately. I nodded slightly even though he could not see it, and then I added, there is one more thing. He waited, attentive. I need to understand what actions can be taken to ensure that everything that was taken from me is addressed properly. I did not say more than that. I did not need to, because the meaning was already clear. There was a pause on the line, longer this time, not from confusion, but from calculation, from understanding the direction of what I was asking. I will include that in the review, he said finally, his voice measured, precise. I thanked him once, quietly, and ended the call, placing the phone back on the table. The room returned to silence, but it was not empty. It was full of intention, full of movement that had not yet happened but was already set into motion. I leaned back slightly in the chair, my hands resting calmly, my breathing even, and I allowed myself one final thought before the next step began to take shape. I had not raised my voice, I had not argued, I had not tried to stop what happened earlier that day, because I had not needed to, and now, as the city lights reflected softly in the window in front of me, one truth became clear in a way that did not require explanation. Silence had never been weakness, it had always been timing, and now, that time was over. The room remained quiet after I ended the call, but it was no longer the kind of silence that followed uncertainty. It was structured, intentional. Like everything inside it had a purpose even if it had not yet revealed itself. I sat there for a moment longer, my hands resting lightly against each other, feeling the steadiness in them, the absence of hesitation, and then I leaned forward slightly, reaching for the envelope again. This time opening it fully and examining its contents more carefully. The card inside was simple but precise, no unnecessary details, just a clean design that suggested access rather than explanation. I turned it over once, then set it down neatly beside the paper with the advisor's contact information. My eyes moved across the room slowly, taking in the space again, not as a place of comfort, but as a place of transition, because I understood something clearly now. This was not where the story paused, this was where it began to shift direction. I stood up and walked toward the small desk near the window, pulling out the chair and sitting down with a quiet, controlled movement. I picked up the hotel phone again and pressed the front desk button. The line connected almost immediately. "Mrs. Lawson, how may we assist you?" The voice was warm, prepared. I spoke calmly. "I will need a driver available first thing in the morning, 8 o'clock. I gave a brief pause, then continued. "And I will need access to a professional wardrobe service tonight." Something appropriate for a business meeting. There was no hesitation on the other end. "Of course, everything will be arranged." I thanked her once and ended the call, placing the receiver back gently. Then I reached into my purse and took out my own phone, holding it in my hand for a moment before unlocking it, my reflection faintly visible on the screen before it lit up. I scrolled through my contacts slowly, not searching randomly, but with intention, stopping when I found the number I was looking for. Richard Lawson. I looked at the name for a second longer than necessary, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted the moment to be exact. Controlled, I pressed the call button and lifted the phone to my ear. It rang once, then twice, then a third time before he answered. His voice sounded the same as it always had, confident, slightly impatient. "Margaret," he said, "I was not expecting your call." I did not respond. Immediately, I let a brief silence sit between us, not long enough to be uncomfortable, but long enough to shift the rhythm of the conversation. Then I spoke, my voice even, calm, unchanged. "I will be coming by the house tomorrow morning," I said. There was a pause on his end, short, but noticeable. "Why?" he asked, his tone cautious now. I looked out the window as I answered, my reflection faint against the glass. "Because there are a few things that need to be clarified," I said simply. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain further. I did not justify anything, because I did not need to. He exhaled slightly, a sound that carried more thought than his words. "Margaret, we already discussed everything. The papers are clear." I let that sit for a moment. Then I replied in the same steady tone. "Yes," I said, "they are." Another pause followed, longer this time, as if he was trying to determine what I was not saying. "What are you getting at?" he asked finally. I allowed a small breath to settle before answering. "You will understand tomorrow," I said, my voice calm, controlled, final, and without waiting for another response, I ended the call, lowering the phone back into my hand. The room returned to silence once again, but this time it felt different, sharper, more defined. I placed the phone down on the table and stood up slowly, walking back toward the window, my hands resting lightly at my sides, my posture steady, because I knew something he did not, something none of them knew. And as I looked out over the city lights that now filled the evening, one thought settled clearly, firmly, without hesitation. Tomorrow would not be a conversation, it would be a correction. The morning light came in softly through the curtains, steady and quiet, and I was already awake before the alarm ever had a chance to sound. I had not slept much, not because of worry, but because my mind had settled into something clear, something structured, the kind of clarity that does not need rest to hold itself together. I sat at the edge of the bed for a moment, my hands resting lightly on my knees, feeling the calm steadiness in my body, no trembling, no hesitation, just a quiet readiness. I stood up and moved through the room with deliberate movements, selecting the clothes that had been delivered the night before, simple, tailored, precise, nothing excessive, nothing soft, just clean lines and intention. I dressed slowly, each motion controlled, because I understood that today was not about emotion, it was about presence. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I did not search for anything new, I simply observed what was already there, the same face, the same expression, but now aligned with something stronger. Something that did not need to prove itself. I picked up my purse, placed the card and the documents inside, and then reached for the door, opening it without pause. The hallway outside was quiet, the elevator arriving within seconds as if it had been waiting, and I stepped inside, standing still as the doors closed and the numbers moved downward one by one. The descent felt steady, controlled, like everything else. When the doors opened into the lobby, the staff acknowledged me immediately. Not with curiosity, but with recognition, the kind that comes from understanding position rather than appearance. The car was already waiting outside, just as requested, the driver stepping forward to open the door. I entered without a word, settling into the seat as the door closed behind me. The city moved around us as we drove, but I did not watch it this time. My focus was not outward, it was forward, directed. The house came into view sooner than expected, familiar in structure but distant in meaning, the same driveway, the same front door, but no longer mine in the way it once was. The car came to a stop, and I stepped out, my shoes meeting the ground with a quiet firmness. I did not rush, I did not hesitate, I walked toward the door with the same steady pace I had carried since the night before, and when I reached it, I raised my hand and knocked once, not loudly, not softly, just enough, the sound clear, controlled. It took only a few seconds before the door opened, and Richard stood there, his expression shifting the moment he saw me, not entirely surprised, but not entirely comfortable either. "Margaret," he said, his tone measured, trying to find its place. I met his gaze without reaction, my posture straight, my voice calm. "I told you I would be here," I said. He stepped slightly to the side, allowing me in, and I walked past him into the house without waiting. The space looked the same, everything in its place, but something about it felt different now, smaller, less significant. Lena was in the living room, standing near the window. She turned when she heard us, her expression polite at first, then tightening slightly as she recognized me. I did not acknowledge her directly, not yet. I simply walked into the center of the room and stopped, placing my purse down gently on the table, my movement slow, deliberate, because I understood something very clearly now. This moment was not about confrontation, it was about correction. Richard cleared his throat slightly, his voice careful. "Margaret, we already went over everything. There is nothing more to discuss." I looked at him calmly, then reached into my purse and took out the card, placing it on the table between us with a quiet, precise motion. His eyes moved to it, then back to me, confusion flickering briefly. "What is that supposed to be?" he asked, his tone edged with uncertainty. I did not answer immediately. I let the silence settle, let the weight of the moment build without interruption. Then I spoke, my voice even, controlled. "You said everything was yours," I said, and I paused just long enough for the words to settle before continuing. That was not entirely accurate. The room grew still, not dramatically, not suddenly, but noticeably, and for the first time since I had stepped through that door, I saw something shift in his expression, something small, but real, and I knew, without needing anything else, that this was the moment everything began to change. Richard's eyes remained on the card for a second longer than necessary, his expression tightening in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, the confidence he had carried the day before no longer sitting as comfortably on his face. Lena shifted slightly near the window, her posture changing as if she sensed something she did not fully understand. I did not move, I did not repeat myself, I simply stood there, allowing the silence to do what it always had, reveal more than words ever could. Richard let out a small breath, then stepped closer to the table, his gaze still fixed on the card. "Margaret," he said slowly, his voice attempting to regain control, "if this is some kind of misunderstanding, we can clear it up through the proper channels. There is no need to make this into something it is not." I met his gaze calmly, my expression unchanged. "It is already exactly what it is," I replied, my voice steady, not raised, not sharp, just clear. He hesitated, just briefly, then reached toward the card, picking it up between his fingers, turning it over as if trying to find something familiar on its surface. There was nothing there for him to recognize, no logo, no numbers, nothing that fit into the structure he understood. "What is this?" he asked again, this time quieter, less certain. I let a moment pass before answering, not because I needed time, but because I wanted him to sit in that uncertainty just a little longer. Then I spoke. "It is something my father left me," I said, his brow tightened slightly, confusion now mixing with something else, something closer to concern. "Your father," he repeated, as if the idea itself did not align with what he believed. I nodded once. "Yes," I said simply, then I took a slow step forward, closing the small distance between us, not in aggression, not in confrontation, but in presence. "Yesterday, you told me everything was yours," I continued, my voice calm, measured. "You were very certain about that." Lena shifted again behind him, her arms crossing slightly, her expression no longer composed. Richard glanced briefly in her direction, then back at me, as if trying to re-establish control of the situation. "Margaret," he said, his tone firmer now, "whatever this is, it does not change the fact that the assets we discussed are legally mine." I listened without interruption, without reaction, and when he finished, I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging. "You are correct," I said, "those assets are legally yours." The word seemed to settle him for a fraction of a second, just long enough for his shoulders to ease slightly, and then I continued, "But that is not what we are discussing anymore." The shift was immediate, subtle, but clear. His posture stiffened again, his grip on the card tightening just slightly. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice no longer as controlled as before. I reached into my purse and removed a single folded document, placing it on the table beside the card, my movements. Slow, precise, intentional. This is a summary of assets that exist entirely outside of anything you have ever had access to, I said, my tone even. You will notice that none of it appears in any of the documents you prepared, because it was never part of them. He did not open the paper immediately. He stared at it first, as if trying to decide whether acknowledging it would confirm something he did not want to face. Lena stepped closer now, her voice cutting in. Richard, what is she talking about? Her tone sharper than before, edged with unease. He did not answer her, his attention fixed on the table, on the card, on the document, on the realization forming slowly but inevitably. I remained still, watching, not pressing, not explaining further, because this moment did not need more words, it needed time, and as that time passed, I saw it, the exact point where certainty gave way to doubt, where control shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. I took a slow breath, then spoke one final time, my voice calm, unwavering. You did not take everything from me, I said, and I paused just long enough for the truth to settle fully into the room before finishing. You only took what I allowed you to see. The silence that followed was not empty, it was final, and for the first time since I walked into that house, I saw exactly what I had been waiting for, not anger, not denial, but understanding, and in that understanding, something else appeared quietly, something that had not been there before. Consequence.